or blood. The gods told you.
Then I defy the gods.
Ever since Nolan had announced his adaptation of the Odyssey, the anticipation around the film has surely turned it into a phenomenon. Homer's Odyssey is truly a tale as old as time, so the spoilers of this 3,000-year-old text are almost common knowledge now. However, we see the Odyssey from Nolan's eye, whose modern sensibility toward the oldest known text in the world swerves in a rather different direction from the source material at the end. After Illiad, the Odyssey is the second part of Homer's epic saga that intricately documents the downfall of Greece after the Trojan War, and how the wrath of the gods influenced it. It's not until the very end that the director finally allows us to understand what the film is really about, and what motivated Nolan to adapt Homer's legendary epic in the first place. So without wasting another moment, let's briefly discuss what happens in the Odyssey before discussing why Nolan chose to go with his own ending of the film, as compared to what we know from Homer's original. So Nolan's film begins as Travis Scott's bard recollects the fall of Troy to the men around him. The next scene takes us to the beaches of Troy, where we see a bunch of Trojans riding down on white horses toward a wooden horse stuck on the beach, while Sinon waits to greet them, only to have his chest filled with arrows. These Trojans regarded the horse as an offering to Athena and started dragging it up the beach. The story then cuts back to the present timeline of the film, where we learn that it's been 8 years since King Odysseus of Ithaca was declared to be missing, and most Greeks have now started believing him to be dead. Naturally, to uphold the law of the gods, Ithaca is brimming with prospective suitors who are aggressively vying to marry Odysseus' wife, Penelope, and by extension become the next king of Ithaca. Of course, Telemachus, the young son of Penelope and Odysseus, is not happy with the current development of events, even if he has never had a proper chance to see his father, who's been away from home for over 2 decades. Telemachus strongly believed that Odysseus would come back home and never wavered from his fierce loyalty toward his father. Now tensions are rising in Ithaca, as the suitors are growing increasingly tired of waiting for Penelope to pick a husband. While Telemachus wanted to claim the throne of Ithaca himself, it doesn't take long for us to understand that he's not ready to take on an entire room full of greedy suitors who secretly want him dead. He understood that it was only a matter of time before his mother took another man as her new husband, which was something Odysseus had ironically instructed Penelope to do before he left for war alongside Agamemnon. So Telemachus sneaks out of Ithaca and takes it upon himself to look for his father. Now, it doesn't take very long for the film to reveal that Odysseus was still indeed alive, but trapped on the island of Ogygia by a nymph named Calypso, who detained him by disguising herself as his lover and friend. While Odysseus often experiences visions of Athena encouraging him to leave Ogygia, Calypso keeps pushing him to reflect on his journey that finally tells us what exactly happened after the fall of Troy. So after an entire decade of fighting the war, Odysseus decides to part ways with Agamemnon and the rest of the Greeks, as he takes his crew toward the west. Even if the locals had warned them, the men pillaged settlements before continuing to go on their way. After they eventually arrived on an island, Odysseus and his men saw a stray sheep and followed it, hoping that it would lead them to an entire flock. Well, they definitely found the flock, but then a monstrous cyclops named Polyphemus also greeted them inside the cave. After being trapped inside, the soldiers came up with an escape plan where they blinded the creature before hiding themselves among the flock of sheep until they could leave the cave the next morning. This was already a pretty risky plan, but it became a bit more unnerving when the blinded cyclops started praying to Poseidon. Now, when the men were trying to make it out, Odysseus shot an arrow back at the cave so as to warn the creature to not interfere with them again. But that only pissed off the Cyclops even more, to the point that it chased them down the beach until they finally managed to get away. Seeing this, a few soldiers began questioning if provoking the Cyclops and deliberately angering the gods was a good move, especially because they still have a very long journey ahead. But Odysseus believed that a person makes their own luck, albeit it doesn't take very long to have this unwavering confidence tested when they get lost at sea and end up landing on a strange island, where they're attacked by a bunch of savage Laestrygonians. As the men run toward the forest, they come across a youngster who screams after seeing them, thus alerting the monstrous man-eating giants to attack them. Odysseus somehow makes it to the shoreline, but then his crew suffers pretty heavy losses when they realize that one of their ships was destroyed. I mean, their supplies were already running pretty low, and there was no safe way for them to make a blind crossing, so it makes sense why the men were losing out on hope. The film then jumps to the current timeline where we see Telemachus meeting the king of Sparta, Menelaus, who also fought alongside Odysseus at Troy. Now, through an extended flashback sequence, we see the whole grueling ordeal that the men had to endure while they were all crammed in the wooden horse on the beach. But after the fall of Troy, Odysseus and Menelaus had gone their own ways. We then finally meet Helen of Troy, the stories of whose beauty to launch 1,000 ships seemed to amuse Menelaus. Well, this version of Helen, as we see, was rather disfigured, with a very prominent scar covering one side of her face. This seemed to be a very clear way for the director to let us know how stories keep changing and distorting over time. Now, flashing back to Odysseus, we see him and his crew arrive on the island of Aea, which was home to a mysterious witch named Circe. When the survivors sought refuge from her, Circe lured them inside with the promise of food, but ended up lacing their meals with drugs. We see how these men cannot stop themselves from eating the food, and before you know it, they eventually succumb to her powerful magic and transform into pigs. Meanwhile, Odysseus had been pushed away by his crew after a mutiny and was hunting outside. After he killed a deer, he realized what was happening, as the deer transformed into a man after being struck by an arrow. So Odysseus confronts Circe, forces her to change his men back, and eventually convinces her to help him return home. As a result, Circe warns him that in order to reach Ithaca, he would have to cross Oceanus to travel to the Underworld and consult the blind prophet named Tiresias. In order to reach it, she instructed him to head north into the twilight until the river of fire meets the river of ice. Of course, Odysseus and his men eventually reach the Underworld and sacrifice sheep in order to summon the dead. Among the ghosts of the Underworld, Odysseus comes across Agamemnon, who recounts the unforeseen betrayal that led to his death. As it turns out, after marrying Helena's twin sister, Clytemnestra, Agamemnon returned home to her by sacrificing Iphigenia to Artemis for her favor, only to get murdered by his wife in cold blood. Odysseus also meets the shade of his cousin Sinon, who's evidently bitter about the lie that was fed to him and led to his death. Sinon also reveals Antinous' treachery, revealing how he was manipulated into taking his place in the Trojan army. At last, he meets the shade of Tiresias, the blind prophet who warns Odysseus how his journey home would be anything but easy, as he would be driven to make impossible choices. Apparently, Poseidon was furious with Odysseus, so Tiresias warns the men to not harm the sacred cattle of the sun god when they eventually arrive on the island of Thrinacia. Lastly, the prophet tells him how only Odysseus would return home, and before you know it, the ghost of his fallen army then come and chase Odysseus and his men from Hades. After Odysseus and his men return to their ships, the entire crew soon encounter Charybdis, Scylla, and the Sirens waiting for them. But Odysseus orders the men to block their ears with wax, hoping that it would protect them from the creature's song. Now, as he continues his perilous journey, we jump back to Antinous making his move on Penelope. Throughout the movie, Nolan does a great job of establishing his character to be shrewd, cunning, and extremely dangerous. Antinous aims to usurp Telemachus by marrying Penelope and having a child of their own. This would not only cut Telemachus out of the royal lineage, but give Antinous a direct route to the throne. Given that the boy has been missing, it didn't take long for him to find out that Telemachus was in Sparta with Menelaus, where the two had been hunting together. During their shared time, Menelaus also helped give Telemachus the courage to do what he believed was necessary, which was obviously return to Ithaca, claim the throne for himself, and lead his people. Menelaus knew that the kid would not simply slaughter every wealthy suitor occupying his palace, as it could ignite an all-out war, so this seemed to be the only realistic solution available to him. However, Antinous put his own plan into motion by sending a group of bandits to Pylos in order to ambush Telemachus at the temple. They were also instructed to kill him and his men before returning with Telemachus' ears and nose as proof of his death. With Telemachus gone, Antinous would definitely be free to marry Penelope without consequence. Now, coming back to our protagonist, we see Odysseus and his crew making it past the Sirens and evading the whirlpool, only to be attacked by a sea monster who ends up killing several men. Seeing how everything keeps getting worse, Eurylochus was furious as he believed that Odysseus had gambled recklessly with the lives of his crew. The survivors then eventually reached the island of Thrinacia, where Odysseus warned them against killing Helios, the sacred cattle, as Tiresias had already warned them of the dire consequences. Unfortunately, strong winds left them stranded on the island for too long. These men were starving, and so, driven by desperation and hunger, Eurylochus and the rest of the crew ended up slaughtering the cattle. Odysseus was the only one who refused to join them. Now, when the wind finally died down, the crew took their chance and returned to sea. However, a monstrous storm that's believed by men to have been sent by an enraged Poseidon ended up destroying their ship and killing the rest of the crew. As the sole survivor of the crash, Odysseus washes ashore on Calypso's island on Ogygia, where the two spend years together. When Odysseus finally realizes how much time has passed, Calypso explains that she had nurtured him with lotus flowers that clouded his mind all this time. Despite this, he continued to cling to the memories of Penelope and Telemachus. Calypso eventually allows him to leave, explaining that he must give himself up to Poseidon, and Odysseus does exactly that by building a makeshift raft that would eventually take him back to Ithaca. After reconciling with the gods, Odysseus finally had the divine support to miraculously reach Ithaca. Following this, Odysseus chose to disguise himself as a beggar in accordance with the advice given to him by the shade of Agamemnon, who had suggested Odysseus get the lay of the land after being away for so long. Of course, that's good advice, as Odysseus' court was taken over by a bunch of rambunctious suitors, all vying for the hand of his wife like hungry jackals. We then see Odysseus reconnect with his old friend Eumaeus, who was now blind and could not realize who he was actually talking to. But that conversation helped Odysseus realize that Telemachus was in trouble, as Antinous set his plan in motion, as the bandits disguised as pilgrims murdered Telemachus' men in cold blood before turning their attention to the unsuspecting prince. Odysseus thankfully arrived to save his son, who didn't take long to figure out that this beggar was actually his missing father, after watching him comfort Argos, who had been waiting all this while for his master to come back home. The affection this so-called beggar showed toward the animal leads Telemachus to realize that the robed stranger standing before him was actually his father. This was a genuinely touching moment, with Telemachus eventually telling him, "Welcome home, stranger," but they kept this a secret just long enough for Odysseus to attend a dinner and observe what these suitors were up to. Now, after they came back to the heart of Ithaca, Telemachus declared that Odysseus was nearby, but had sent him ahead in his place. He then instructed the palace to organize a banquet that evening and invite all of the suitors. On the other hand, when Antinous saw Telemachus had returned home unharmed, he struggled to conceal his rage and surprise. Meanwhile, Penelope was furious and would rather burn the lot of them, but she reluctantly agreed to attend the banquet instead. Now, during the banquet, Odysseus deliberately provokes Antinous and introduces himself as Sinon by taking the name of the bravest man he ever knew. This naturally unsettles Antinous, who throws a bowl at the supposed beggar's head, and this is an act that violates the laws of Zeus regarding hospitality. It leads Telemachus to declare that the feast is over, and once the suitors have left by the end of the evening, Odysseus, who's still in disguise, is called forth by Penelope to speak privately. As it turns out, the queen likes to talk to travelers in order to get potential news of her husband, and to this, the beggar explains how homecoming is never easy, and that Odysseus is not truly home just yet. He also confesses his guilt for violating Zeus's law with the Trojan horse and desecrating a statue of Athena after killing her priestess. Well, suffice to say, their conversation ends with Penelope offering a challenge to the suitors, something that ostensibly will lead her to marry whoever can win the contest. Having said that, I want to mention that Odysseus came back home as a man devoid of all hope. He simply wanted to see if any of Penelope's suitors were actually worthy of her hand, based on the way they might treat him as a beggar. But the only kindness he encountered came from his son, which assured him that maybe all hope for the future was not yet lost after all. That's why he made sure to devise a plot with Telemachus and set a trap for all the devious suitors. And the next evening, after the contest is finally revealed, we find out that the suitors will participate in a challenge that Penelope knows only Odysseus can win, which is stringing his bow and firing an arrow through a line of axes, as opposed to the whole immovable bed situation from the original poem. Of course, there's only one person who ends up accomplishing this challenge. Odysseus finally reveals himself only after he wins the challenge, thus prompting all the suitors to attack him. Luckily, Telemachus had his back as they fought and killed all of them, including Antinous, who rose up to take command of the remaining men by ordering them to retrieve all the weapons of the suitors that Telemachus had hid before the contest began. Of course, Odysseus makes Antinous' death deliberately slow by giving him a message delivered to the fallen men waiting in Hades, that Odysseus intended to honor them by traveling west. Even if Odysseus is injured in the process, the wounds were not fatal, much to Penelope's relief. Instead, he keeps the promise that he made to Sinon by choosing to sail off into the west to honor his fallen soldiers. He also uses this as going into exile as punishment for killing suitors of all the noble houses. Of course, this is just a part of his plan, as he really wants to sail off into the sunset with his beloved wife and live his last days in peace. It was also what Penelope had wanted before Odysseus had left for the Trojan War. At the end of the Odyssey, Telemachus is named as the next rightful king of Ithaca and tasked to keep the land safe as his parents sail away toward the west. While the Odyssey follows one man's dangerous journey home, Nolan's version is just as much about Odysseus trying to live with the consequences of what he believes he had set in motion. After witnessing the fall of Troy, he could not shake the feeling that the horrors that unfolded were made possible by his own idea of the Trojan horse. Instead of longing to return home, he was weighed down by guilt after being convinced that he helped unleash a cycle of violence that could continue long after the war. As the world around him edged closer to more conflict, Odysseus carried that burden alone. Naturally, the films circle back to the fall of Troy in its closing moments, revisiting the city's destruction and the fate of the wooden horse. It's a sort of reminder that while kingdoms fall, their stories live on through songs, legends, and the people who continue to tell them. For me, the emotional payoff comes in the final act through Zendaya's Athena. Throughout the film, the goddess appears beside Odysseus, guiding him and challenging him as he struggles with his past. But the ending reveals a heartbreaking truth, as the woman he's been seeing was not Athena's true form, but rather the young priestess of the goddess who was brutally killed during the sack of Troy. That face has haunted Odysseus ever since, and his mind transforms her into Athena because she had become the physical embodiment of his guilt, grief, and regret. This last devastating revelation completely reframed his journey, thus emphasizing that his greatest battle was never against monsters or angry gods, but against the guilt-ridden memories he could never escape. Well, that brings us to the very end of this video. What do you guys think about the changes Nolan made in his version of the Odyssey? Let us know in the comment box down below.